Okay, I think all right. I think there's no longer a lineup at the door. So, good morning. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. This is the editor of My Jewish Learning, and this is, of course, our Daf Yomi Week in Lightning Review every Thursday at 9:30 Eastern, which is a different time for many of you on this call. Part of what is so much fun about learning with you. We are joined today for the second time by Rabbi Ari Sachs. You met him once, maybe about a month ago, Rabbi Sachs. Is that right?
Yeah, about a month ago or so.
Joining us
Right.
today from Philadelphia, and you can also find him in the wild with his podcast called Interfaithing. So if that is a subject that interests you, you can look for that as well. But today we are going to steer around a couple of sugyot from this week's daf, couple of conversations in the Gemara. And I believe we're going to be talking about orality again.
Yes.
Okay,
Well,
I'm going to share the source sheet now. I'll share it again in a few minutes for people who come in late. Go ahead,
and I'm
Rabbi.
also I'm also going to be screen sharing the source so that you'll be able to see it on the screen. Um, and that way we can kind of look at it all together. So, hello everyone. I'm Rabbi Ari Sachs from Philadelphia. So glad to be joining you again. The sources, the section of Talmud that we're going to be looking at uh, the is from the Dapim 70 to 76 or so from Masechet Bava Kama. The overall kind of topics include issues surrounding testimony and payment. There's even a section around the desecration of Shabbat and what that looks like, or stealing an animal on Yom Kippur. I mean, none of us would steal an animal on Yom Kippur. Not sure why they have to talk about it, but they do. And also the regulations around cooking food on Shabbat. What happens when you have conspiring witnesses who kind of come together to indicate that they kind of work together to undermine the system, and how do you deal with them? And then, of course, something important for all of us, which is the value of a slave's eye or tooth. That is something important for our day. No, it's not. But there it was back in that day. And so thinking about how do all of these texts mean something to us? Sometimes the topics actually mean a lot, and sometimes it's really about understanding why we're studying Talmud in the first place. And the argument that I made last time, which comes from a rabbi named Rav Hutner, who was an early 20th century rabbi, that the purpose of studying Talmud is to be a part of the covenant of the oral tradition between God and the Jewish people. If the covenant of Torah was simply written down, then anyone could access it. Anyone. But the unique nature of the covenant between God and the Jewish people is that it is an oral tradition passed down between people, among people, between teachers and students over the course of generations. The Talmud, even though it is written down, is actually reminiscent, or I shouldn't say reminiscent, but actually holds and affirms the centrality of the orality of the tradition that is being passed down by individuals, even in its final formulation. And we're going to take a look at how that orality is developed within the context of the tradition. And I think, especially with one of the sugyot, you're going to really appreciate even the mistakes. Yes, they do make some, the mistakes that the rabbis make, and how those mistakes actually reinforce this notion of the orality as the central piece of Talmud study and of the covenant. And so with that, we're just going to jump right into the text. The way we're going to do this is that there's a few different phrases that appear often throughout the text if you're studying it in the Hebrew. And I'm going to focus a little bit on some of those phrases because, again, these phrases are designed to help indicate that there is an oral tradition that is being discussed. So the first one that you can be able to see on your screen, the first one you're going to see on your screen is a phrase called Ika de Amre. Now, this is Aramaic for Yesh Omrim. There are those who say, or specifically, there are some authorities who say and others say. This term introduces another version of a statement in the Talmud or another version of an entire Talmudic discussion. So if you think about it, that there's an argument being made, and then the text says, oh, Ika da Amre, there are those who say. And either we're going to get another example of this statement that appears in the Talmud in a little bit of a different way, Or you're going to get an entire Talmudic discussion that seemingly is kind of irrelevant to the topic we're talking about, but it's kind of like saying, Joe went to the store on Friday. Well, did you know there are those who say that Joe loves to be able to take his car out every single day, and on some days he goes to the store, and some days he goes to go work out, right? It's like, oh yeah, this reminded me of something else. So the phrase ikata amre in and of itself has that notion of that this is a conversation going on, and we're bringing in different ideas in the same space. We're not just kind of going in a linear way. And there are two different ways in which this phrase is used. In some instances, the two versions are substantially different. So, in thinking about if there's a statement in the Talmud and then somebody says, you know what, well, hold on a second. There's another version of this in which they're very different from one another. So, how do we deal with that? And then in some instances, the two versions differ not about the content of the statement, but about its authorship or about the structure of a Talmudic discussion. Especially thinking about authorship, that's an important piece. Meaning, if you have, let's say, Rabbi Sachs said X, Y, and Z, and then somebody else said, "Oh no, it was Rabbi Greenberg who said X, Y, and Z." Now, to some degree, who said a statement isn't that important, and in some cases, it is extremely important for understanding the nature of how this text has been transmitted to us. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that as we go on. But let's go deep into the text right now. So this is from Bava Kama 70a, earlier on this past week. And this has to do with the matters of not of testimony per se, but particularly about the ways in which you can be able to determine who is responsible for a certain piece of property. That if you have a property that belongs to you, but it's like a movable property, so for instance, a ring that belongs to you, but it's not in your hand, to what extent do you have to own it? Do you have to have it in your hand in order for it to still be considered yours? Or is it a case of kind of like finders, keepers, losers, sweepers, where if you don't have it and somebody else gets it, then it belongs to them and not to you, even if it originally did belong to you. So the sages of Nehardea say, and we're going to come back to the sages of Nehardea, one cannot write a document of authorization or an orakta to assign another to collect a debt or a deposit a movable property on his behalf. Meaning that you can't simply say that this person is allowed to be able to take something of yours, which is potentially movable in some manner, like that you can be able to give a ring, because a ring which is movable, you might lose it or somebody else might have it. And so therefore, how do you know, or how does someone know that let's say somebody lost a ring and then it was found on the street and somebody else picked it up, and then somehow there was an individual that this person who was given that authorization found the person who found the ring and said, "Oh, it now belongs to me." But the problem is that, no, I found it on the street. So when it comes to movable property, that might be more of an issue than, let's say, I sell my home to this individual, or I give this as my home to this other person for them to now take, or whatever it may be. So that's why it's talking about movable property different than immovable property. So now we're talking about Rav Ashi said to Amemar, what is the reason for this halacha? Amemar said to him, it is due to a principle stated by Rabbi Yochanan. As Rabbi Yochanan says, if one stolen item and the owners have not yet despaired of recovering it, thinking about, again, this ring, but maybe it wasn't that it was found, it was stolen, neither of them is able to consecrate it, meaning that the owners are not able to actually say that they can write authorization to be able to take the ring because they don't have it. They don't know where it is. This one, the thief, cannot consecrate the item because it does not belong to him. And that one, the owner cannot consecrate it because it is not in his possession, as I was just explaining. And then here is Rav Steinsaltz kind of explaining that a little bit more. The granting of authority to collect a debt involves the transfer of ownership of the item or money from the owner to the collector. Otherwise, the debtor could refuse to convey it to the collector. In the case of movable property, as it is being held by another, it is not in the possession of the owner. Just as the owner cannot consecrate this item, he cannot transfer ownership of it. If you want to give your ring to somebody, you can't just say, oh, you go find the ring, or it's not here. You have to actually give them the ring. Okay, that's sort of the key point here Rabbi Yochanan says. But let's understand this now from the context of orality. I mentioned before the sages of Nehardea. So Nehardea was the earlier version of the yeshiva called Pumbedita. There are two main yeshivot that occurred during the 6th century of Amoraim, of sages in Babylonia. One was Sura, and the other was a Pumbedita. It actually started in the 2nd century of these Amoraim these Amoraic sages around like 400 of the Common Era. Now, Nehardea was led by a rabbi named Shmuel. You may have recognized Shmuel from a conversation between Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel. Now, Rav was the leader of Sura, and Shmuel was the leader of Pumbedita. Shmuel had many different students. One of them was a Maimar. Now, a Maimar was most likely a direct student of Shmuel, or if not, was a student of one of Shmuel's students. But the other person to consider here that's important is Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi is one of the most important sages that we have in the Talmud, because Rav Ashi is the one who actually was ultimately responsible for assembling what we have as our manuscript of the Talmud. He is from the latest of all different generations of sages of the Amoraim, and he was responsible for the final collection and editing of the actual Talmud itself. He was very wealthy, and so he was able to kind of have a lot of people, a lot of sages live with him, live near him, and then gave him the time to be able to do this work. But here's how it's described in terms of the process of the transmission of the Talmud from the moment of the early Tanaim, of the sages of the Mishnah, through the Amoraim, and then the collection of all this Talmudic material, and ultimately what Rav Ashi is doing here. The first two generations of Amoraim explained the sources and the reasoning behind the Mishnah, including in that is Rav and Shmuel. The third generation began organizing and clarifying the Amoraic commentary on the Mishnah. Under Rava and Abaye, who are 3rd, 4th century Amoraim, the traditions were clarified, contradictions were reconciled, correct authorships were determined, and the discussions of Abaya and Rava were included in the Gemara. During the 6th generation of Amoraim, under the leadership of Rav Ashi, the new Amoraic material was arranged and integrated into the Gemara, and some older traditions were clarified and finalized. After Rav Ashi, the early Savoraim did not add any new halachic decisions, but only clarified some existing traditions and made technical improvements. But for all intents and purposes, it's Rav Ashi who did the final job of incorporating the majority of halachot. So this is what's happening with what Rav Ashi said to Maimar. Rav Ashi is from a later generation. Maimar is probably one of the older teachers who may have studied under Shmuel. And because this was the sages of Nehardea, he's saying, Rav Ashi's like, okay, I got to put this down in the Talmud. Maimar, can you tell me what's the reason behind this halakha? Because I hear that it comes from the sages of Nehardea. You were there. So what was being said? And this is Maimar giving that response to Rav Ashi, who needs to write it down for us to be able to have to learn from today. Now, Maimar, when he's bringing in Rabbi Yochanan, what's fascinating about Rabbi Yochanan is that Rabbi Yochanan was not in Babylonia. Rabbi Yochanan was actually in Israel. Rabbi Yochanan sometimes came to Babylonia, but he is one of the even earlier sages. He was one of the sages that Rav or Shmuel would be going to. And Rabbi Yochanan, because of his erudition, that, and he would sometimes come to the to the yeshivot of Surah and Pupadita from Israel. He would come and offer a teaching. And so this is a Maimar, like thinking about it like 60 years later, saying, oh yeah, Rabbi Yochanan came and gave me a shiur about 30 or 40 years ago, and this is what he said, right? That's what's happening here. So maybe it makes sense then to see what what happens now, which is, take a look at what happens in the very next section. I'm going to come back to the piece I just skipped. There are those who state a different version of this halacha. Okay? There are those who state a different version of this halacha. The sages of Nehardea say one cannot write a document of authorization for the collection of movable property that the bailee or the debtor has denied owing. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the different details of what this really means here, but the key difference here, if you take a look at the Hebrew, in the original that we have up here, okay, it says La katvinan orachta amitaltali, right? One cannot write a document of authorization. But in the one that said there are those who say, it says La katvinan orachta amitaltali dechafre. This one word that's been changed, or this one word that's been added. Or to put it another way, you have one group of people who came from that school of Nehardea or who were taught by some of those teachers, and they remember it one way, and another group is saying, oh no, we learned a little bit different, and it's only one word that's different. But if you think about the nature of orality, of traditions being passed down, I think it makes sense to think that some people might have gotten it wrong. And it goes a little bit deeper with that, which is that this particular section says that, I should say that the reason why we had this halacha from Rabbi Yochanan is because of something that Rabbi Zera said in Masechet Kiddushin. When Rabbi Zera ascended to Eretz Yisrael, he stated this halacha before Rabbi Yochanan, who said to him, did Rav actually say so? This indicates that Rabbi Yochanan disagreed with the statement of Rav that these halachot can be learned from the Mishnah, which leads the Gemara to ask, but didn't he himself say so? And didn't Rabbi Yochanan say, if one robbed another of an item and its owner has not despaired of recovering it, neither of them can consecrate the stolen item? That's the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Zera was one of the students of Shmuel who went back and forth between Israel and Babylonia at times. And when he came to Eretz Yisrael, he had this teaching from, he went to Rabbi Yochanan and got this teaching from him, which means, here's the crazy thing. I want to stop the share for just a moment because I want you to see this for me. Rav Amemar may have received this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan, not from Rabbi Yochanan himself, but from Rabbi Zera, who actually went to Rabbi Yochanan and then passed it down, which means he's actually receiving it even secondhand from one of his other teachers, but not even mentioning that other teacher. We only know this because, I know it because Sefaria was able to have an easy connection to that section in Kiddushin. But anytime that you have a statement in the Talmud, you have to think, where else does a statement appear and how is it a little bit different? Now, it may be that the statement from Rabbi Yochanan is absolutely correct, but the point is that the nature of bringing in Rabbi Yochanan's teaching, especially in the way that Amemar did, expresses the orality of the text itself, which is then emphasized by the fact that there's an Ika Da'amre here that says there's actually another version of this. And that other version has one little word that's different, but that actually changes the nature of what the argument is to the point where if we continue reading, Rabbi Yochanan's not brought in anymore. His point is irrelevant. So that this other opinion's like, well, no, we didn't get that message from Rabbi Yochanan, that shiur. That shiur was 2 weeks prior to it. That you're misremembering exactly what happened. It's these mistakes, or maybe not mistakes, but just that orality that's built into the text that I think really gives the Talmud a sense of just really powerful teachings about the ways in which we learn, and how about by studying it now, we are studying the ways in which rabbis are learning one from the other, and that's really the core of what Jewish learning is. It's not about studying Jewish text necessarily in the right way, but it's about studying the right text. And we're studying the right text, and we're learning about it in our own really interesting way. Okay, I'm going to get to one more, and this is one of my favorites, by the way, when I was preparing for today. So this is a second sugya. The phrase here is similar to the Ika de Amre, which is Ika de Matne La. There is someone who teaches it. After the Talmud has presented a statement of an Amora, or again, this the second groups of folks who are really responsible for the Gemara itself, as referring to a Mishnah or a Braita. A Braita is a section from the Tanaim, from the earlier rabbis of the Mishnah, but is not necessarily mentioned in the Mishnah itself.
Rabbi Sachs, would you put the
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
back on your screen?
I totally forgot that I have to actually share it again. Hold on. Let me do that. All right. That contends at the same. So this formula is used to introduce a different tradition that contends that that same Amoraic statement refers to a different Mishnah or Braita. So basically, it means we're going to get an Amoraic statement in a moment, and we're going to see that according to a different tradition, it appears and it references a separate Mishnah or Braita. So which one is it actually referring to? This comes from Bava Kama 72a, and I highlighted a little bit of the piece that I want to focus on. Bava Kama 72a, the Mishnah teaches a thief who slaughters the animal but was found to be treif, right? It's no good. And likewise, a thief who slaughters a non-sacred animal in the temple courtyard pays the fourfold or fivefold payment. This is the most taxing payment that you can make, that you generally would need multiple witnesses to come and testify that they did this, because it's very onerous on the person. And saying that if it was found to be, not only is it the fact that a thief took this animal, but it was found to be treif, like that requires that fourfold or fivefold payment. Then Rav Chavivi of Mechoza said to who else? Rav Ashi. Because again, Rav Ashi, one of his jobs is to collect these different traditions and make sure that they are in the final version of the Talmud. Conclude from the Mishnah that the act of slaughtering is considered to have been performed only at the end of the slaughtering process. Okay, doesn't that seem clear, or isn't that obvious? But this is what it means. Rav Chavivi Mechoza explains, as if you say that the act of slaughtering lasts from beginning to end, i.e., the halakhic ramifications of slaughtering are in effect throughout the process, one could raise a question with regard to the case of one who slaughters a non-sacred animal in the temple courtyard. Once he slaughtered the animal a bit at the very start of the act of slaughter, he has prohibited the animal with regard to deriving benefit as a non-sacred animal slaughtered in the temple courtyard. Meaning that if it is a non-sacred animal at first, then by virtue of starting the slaughter, not the end of the slaughter, but the beginning of the slaughter, that he's not able to actually derive any benefit from it because it is non-sacred and it is occurring in the temple courtyard. When he slaughters the other part, it is already prohibited with regard to deriving benefit, which means it is not an animal that belongs to its owner that he slaughters. Since deriving benefit from the animal is prohibited, it has no value, therefore there is no ownership. So the reason why this is important is because he's kind of, I was going to say splitting hairs or cutting the animal in half. It's if in the first part, this animal belongs to someone, and that the if the slaughtering that you're really talking about here in terms of the Mishnah, that a thief slaughters an animal but it was found to be treif, that if you were only to look at the first part of it, then the first half of the slaughtering, then it would actually belong to the thief, and he would be required to pay fourfold, fivefold payments on just the first half, because once it is then prohibited after the cutting of the first half of the slaughter, the second half, oh, it doesn't belong to anyone, therefore the thief, it doesn't own it and doesn't need to pay payment on that. That's why they're kind of splitting hairs here. And what he's saying is that the Mishnah is coming to teach us, no, you don't have to think about it that way. You have to think about it as slaughtering the whole animal because that's obvious, but he just wants to make that clear. But the reason I'm raising this is because I want you to keep this in mind. Eina lishchita ela levasov. The act of slaughtering is considered to have been performed only at the end of the slaughtering process. Remember that phrase, okay? Now we're going to get to Bava Kama 72a. We're just continuing the sugya. There are those who teach that the preceding exchange took place with regard to the following dispute, meaning, Ika dematzne la. There are those who teach that this teaching from not Rabbi Yochanan, but this teaching the Rav Chavivi is passing along to Rav Ashi, that it comes from a different place. And where does that place come? Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, in the name of Rabbi Levi the elder, the act of slaughtering is considered to have been performed only at the end of the slaughtering process. And Rabbi Yochanan says, the act of slaughtering lasts from beginning to end. Okay? So that's the section in which it's referring to. The people here are important, not Rabbi Levi. Love Rabbi Levi, but he's not the most important person here. It is actually in regard to Shimon ben Lakish, otherwise known as Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan were colleagues. They were a pair, just like Rav and Shmuel were a pair. Hillel and Shammai were a pair. Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan were a pair. And they have some of the great stories, really powerful stories about what their relationship looks like as Chevrutot. But because they are so connected, I want you to consider what happens here. Because remember, this is a section that says there are those who teach, meaning they are bringing this other, they're saying, oh, no. What you just brought about this slaughtering thing in Bava Kama, that actually appears here in this other place, originally brought by Rabbi Shimon, and then actually based upon what Rabbi Yochanan says. But then where is that other place? Thank you, Safaria, for your help. The Gemara answers that Reish Lakish, this comes from Kiddushin. The Gemara answers that Reish Lakish could have said to you, this Tana of the Breita maintains that the obligation to pay a person's wage is incurred only at the end of the period for which he was hired. Well, what the heck are we talking about? We're not talking about being paid. We're talking about slaughtering. Remember I said to pay attention to that phrase of Eina lishchita ela levasof, right? In Bava Kama, when they were bringing it up from Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Yeshna lishchita mitchila ve'ad sof. This phrase in Kiddushin, Eina lischirut ela levasof. Is it possible that someone got confused between the words lishchita and lischirut? Meaning that they thought, or to put another way, that the person who was passing along the teaching misremembered what was taught and said Ella lishchita when really it was Ella lischirut, and making a whole bunch of confusion about what happened. And to make matters even more clear about this and how that confusion happens, that text, which I took off the screen, that text from Kiddushin comes from who? Reish Lakish. And that's also easily to be mistaken. Meaning, who said it? Oh, it was Reish Lakish or Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan said it. Maybe Reish Lakish said it. I'm not so sure. But what's so fascinating is that not just did the Talmud keep that, but they even used this terminology of Ika da'amre, Ika dematne la, to indicate to us there's another tradition here. And by virtue of me bringing in this tradition, I'm going to show you that these stories are passed around in different ways and in different times. And if you go deeper into the text, which is what we're doing here, what we learn is that the mistakes, that the misrememberings, that the fact that these are occurring multiple generations later reminds us that this is an oral text and that we can still sense that orality in what we are learning today. It is not a text that we simply say, oh, the Talmud says X, Y, and Z, therefore that's it. That's not the job of the Talmud. You can make an argument that's the job of halacha or halachic teachings, but that's a separate conversation. The job of Talmud is to remind us that Torah is meant to be passed down from one generation to the next in conversation, and that misremembering and that making it a human exchange is part and parcel of what this piece of learning, of what this job is of Torah learning. You're muted.
I'm muted. It is on the hour. Thank you so much, Rabbi Sachs, for that really invigorating tour through the ways this page is put together and these conversations appear on the page. It is really hard sometimes, I think, for us because we don't live in the same kind of oral culture. We're not encouraged to memorize teachings in the same way, right? We can pull up the written word so quickly now with a phone in our pocket, right? But if you spend time with the Talmud, you realize how oral that culture is and how much it depends on memorization, because there's so much less written word and remembering what people said and remembering texts and there's this fluidity, I think, sometimes between what's oral and what's written a little bit.
I also want to say that it also makes it feel a little bit more, I don't know, normal or human. Like making a mistake between Ella Lishchita and Ella Lischirut. I could easily make that mistake. Like the words are so similar. And so it reminds us that these are real people who are offering these teachings and trying to remember and not afraid to express or to share that there are these different versions. And I think that should give us hope that people have a willingness to learn and to be willing to be fully themselves within the context of the text itself.
Absolutely. Sometimes I allow myself to make a book recommendation at the end of these classes. So Rabbi Sachs, you can tell me what you think of this one. This is actually kind of getting to be an old book. It's called The Talmud and the Internet, but it sort of draws an analogy between the way the conversation unfolds in the Talmud and the way that sort of like message boards or web pages evolve over time. And
I read that. It's a great book. It's a great
certainly book. The Talmud is like one of those texts, and today's lesson, I think, was especially demonstrative of this, that just would really benefit from hyperlinking.
Yes, it would.
If only the rabbis had the technology of hyperlinking.
The other thing, by the way, I would just, if you're making a book recommendation, some of the teachings I had about who these individuals are, is a great resource. It's called Who's Who in the Talmud by Shulamith Freeman. Does a great job of letting you know who are these individuals, when did they live, who were their teachers, who did they study, who learned from them, how often were they mentioned in the Talmud, and what are their roles. Really invaluable resource for really getting a deeper sense as to who these individuals are.
That is also a great book. I've got that one on my shelf too. And I consult it all the time. She did a whole lot of research. And because for these folks, these were their colleagues and their ancestors and their students, right? It is not that huge a group of people that they really know who these people are. And these are real places to them as well. But for us, it's so far away that it's harder to keep track of some of those things.
Absolutely.
And even years into this journey, as some of us in this call are, it can be hard to keep track of all these personalities. But as time goes on, we learn them better and we get to know them better and better. So thank you so much for this lesson today. Thank you to all of you.
My pleasure.
Did I I'm seeing some requests for the book link. So let me share it again. This is the Talmud, and what is the precise title? Let me get the precise title.
I think it's the Talmud.
The Talmud and the Internet. And then I believe the other one is Who's Who in the Talmud. So let me grab a link to that as well. Sorry for talking and searching my computer at the same time. There's the other one. And it was lovely to see you all today. Thank you. Oh, and I would be remiss not to mention that if you enjoyed learning with Rabbi Sachs today, you can learn with him and us, My Jewish Learning, tomorrow through our weekly Torah portion class, which is on Friday mornings Eastern. Let me see if I can grab that information really quickly. Here is the sign up for that class. That is an ongoing class with us as well, with a rotating group of teachers, just as this class is. But it's time for us to let everybody get on with their day. So thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Thank you to all of you for being part of this community and joining us and for your comments and questions. And we will see you in your inbox tomorrow morning and in this space in exactly a week.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Shabbat shalom.